The federal courtroom fell silent. Judge Harold Whitmore looked down at the defendant, a quiet woman in civilian clothes, no lawyer, no family in attendance. "Ma'am, you're charged with unauthorized entry to a classified government facility. How do you plead?" She sat motionless for a moment, then slowly reached into her jacket. The bailiff tensed, but she simply pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." She placed the document on the table. When the judge read it, his face went completely white. "Welcome to Real Heroes Stories YouTube. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from today. And if you believe Real Heroes stories deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe. March 15th, 2024, Federal District Court, Washington, D.C., 2:30 p.m. Judge Harold Whitmore had built his reputation over 28 years on the federal bench by being tough, uncompromising, and absolutely intolerant of defendants who thought they were above the law. Today's case was exactly the type he relished. A clear-cut national security violation with overwhelming evidence, and a defendant arrogant enough to represent herself. Dr. Alexandra Kane sat alone at the defense table, no attorney beside her despite facing charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison. She wore a simple navy blazer and white blouse, her shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back professionally. What struck Judge Whitmore as particularly suspicious was her complete calm. No fidgeting, no visible stress, just the composed demeanor of someone who seemed entirely unworried about the serious federal charges against her. "Dr. Kane," Judge Whitmore began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in federal courtrooms, "you stand accused of unauthorized penetration of the Pentagon building, violation of multiple security protocols, and conducting activities in classified areas where your presence constituted a clear threat to national security. These charges carry sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison." Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Morrison sat at the prosecution table with a briefcase full of evidence, security camera footage showing Dr. Kane in restricted Pentagon corridors, federal agent testimony documenting her unauthorized presence, and timestamp data proving she had been in areas requiring above top-secret clearance for extended periods on March 12, 2024. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Judge Whitmore continued. "Security cameras captured clear images of you in multiple restricted areas. Federal agents documented your presence in locations where unauthorized access constitutes serious felony violations. I'll ask you one final time, do you want legal representation before we proceed?" Alexandra Kane had been listening quietly, her hands folded in her lap, studying the judge with the same calm attention she had maintained throughout the preliminary hearings. "Your Honor, I appreciate the court's concern for my representation. However, I believe that once the court has complete information about my presence at the Pentagon facility, these charges will be resolved quickly." Judge Whitmore felt his patience wearing thin. "Dr. Kane, I've been on this bench for 28 years. I've heard every excuse and justification for criminal behavior. Unless you're about to tell me you had legitimate authorized access to those areas, which our investigation has definitively determined you did not, then I suggest you enter a plea so we can proceed to sentencing." "Your Honor," Alexandra said, her voice remaining calm and measured, "I understand your skepticism. However, there may have been some confusion regarding the exact nature and authorization for my activities at the Pentagon facility." Morrison looked up sharply from her files. "Your Honor, the defendant seems to be attempting some kind of misunderstanding defense. Our investigation was thorough and conclusive. Dr. Kane had no official business at the Pentagon, no security clearance for the areas where she was observed, and no authorization from any government agency for her presence in those locations. Judge Whitmore nodded approvingly. Dr. Kane, Miss Morrison raises an excellent point. If you had legitimate authorization to be in those areas, where is your security clearance documentation? Where are your access credentials? Where is any evidence whatsoever that you were conducting authorized activities? Alexandra Kane reached slowly into the inside pocket of her navy blazer. Bailiff Robert Martinez immediately stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon as his 22 years of court security experience kicked in. I'm just retrieving a document, Alexandra said quietly, her movements deliberate and clearly non-threatening. She withdrew a folded piece of paper and placed it carefully on the defense table. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit this document for your review. I believe it will provide the necessary context to resolve these charges. Judge Whitmore gestured impatiently for the bailiff to retrieve the document, expecting to see some amateur legal brief or irrelevant correspondence that would waste more of the court's time. Martinez approached the defense table cautiously, picked up the paper, and carried it to the judge's bench. Whitmore unfolded the document and began reading, expecting either routine paperwork with no relevance to the charges or an obvious forgery that would add document fraud to Dr. Kane's legal troubles. Instead, what he saw made him freeze completely, his confident expression faltering as if someone had just told him everything he believed about the case was wrong. The document was printed on official United States government letterhead with security markings and classification stamps that Judge Whitmore had never seen before, but instinctively recognized as being far above his security clearance level. At the top, in bold lettering that seemed to command attention, were the words, Presidential Authorization for Classified Operations, Eyes Only, Congressional Notification Required. Below the heading was a series of codes, reference numbers, and clearance levels that meant nothing to Judge Whitmore, but clearly indicated a level of government authorization completely outside his experience as a federal judge. The document identified Dr. Alexandra Kane as an external strategic operations consultant with above top-secret clearance and presidential authorization required status. The mission details were what truly stunned him. The document outlined Operation Ghost Retrieval with dates spanning March 12th to 16th, 2024, describing it as a classified extraction mission, 12 American hostages, terrorist organization Crimson Dawn, Libya underground facility, emergency presidential authorization. At the bottom, in bold letters that seemed to leap off the page, was the mission result. Mission accomplished. All objectives achieved. 0 casualties. Complete operational success. All 12 American hostages extracted safely. The authorization signatures included names that Judge Whitmore recognized from the highest levels of government. Officials whose signatures appeared on documents that affected national security at levels far beyond anything that typically came through his courtroom. Judge Whitmore looked up from the document to find Dr. Kane watching him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the proceeding, but now he saw something completely different in her demeanor. Not the desperation of a defendant facing prison time, but the patient professionalism of someone who had been trying to prevent a serious institutional mistake from occurring. Dr. Kane, Judge Whitmore said, his voice noticeably less authoritative than it had been moments before. This document, can you help the court understand exactly what this means? Alexandra nodded respectfully, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the dramatic shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Your Honor, The charges against me stem from my presence at the Pentagon on March 12th for an emergency classified mission briefing. Operation Ghost Retrieval was a presidential-level authorization to extract 12 American citizens who were being held hostage by the terrorist organization Crimson Dawn in an underground facility in Libya and were scheduled for execution beginning that same day. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Court reporter Sarah Chen had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys as she tried to process what she was hearing. Bailiff Martinez found himself unconsciously standing straighter, his years of military service before joining court security creating an automatic response to the mention of classified operations and hostage extraction missions. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison was staring at her carefully assembled case files as if they had suddenly become written in a foreign language. Every piece of evidence she had prepared, every witness statement she had organized, every legal argument she had constructed was now potentially meaningless if Dr. Kane's authorization document was legitimate. Dr. Kane, Judge Whitmore continued, struggling to maintain his judicial composure while internally grappling with the magnitude of what he was confronting. You're telling this court that on March 12th, while you were allegedly committing federal crimes, you were actually receiving authorization for a classified mission to save American lives? Yes, Your Honor. The mission briefing took place in Conference Room Alpha 7 under the direct supervision of General William Crawford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with senior officials from Naval Intelligence, Special Operations Command, and the Central Intelligence Agency. The unauthorized access that forms the basis of these charges was actually a presidentially authorized emergency consultation conducted at the highest levels of national security. Judge Whitmore set the document down carefully on his bench and removed his glasses, rubbing his temples as he tried to process the full implications of what he was hearing. In 28 years on the federal bench, he had never encountered anything remotely similar to this situation. Dr. Kane, he said carefully, assuming this document is authentic, and I have no expertise to determine its legitimacy, why wasn't this information provided to the prosecution before these charges were filed? Why allow this case to proceed to the point of arraignment if you had evidence of legitimate government authorization? Alexandra's response was measured and professional, revealing nothing of the complex operational security considerations that had governed every aspect of her activities since the mission's inception. Your Honor, Operation Ghost Retrieval required complete operational security throughout the mission timeline. The nature of the threat to American hostages, the sensitive intelligence sources involved, and the international implications of the extraction required that all mission details remain classified until after successful completion and congressional notification. She paused briefly, allowing the judge to process this information before continuing. The document I've provided was declassified for judicial review only yesterday morning, following the successful completion of the mission and the safe return of all 12 American hostages to United States territory. The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything everyone in the courtroom thought they knew about the case. Judge Whitmore found himself confronting the possibility that he had been preparing to incarcerate someone who had just completed one of the most successful hostage rescue operations in recent American history. Dr. Kane, he said slowly, are you telling this court that while these charges were being prepared and filed, you were actually engaged in saving American lives? Yes, Your Honor. The 12 American citizens who were successfully extracted from terrorist custody completed their medical evaluations yesterday and are currently being reunited with their families. The operation was completed with 0 casualties and no international diplomatic complications. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison finally found her voice, though her usual prosecutorial confidence had been replaced by obvious uncertainty. Your Honor, if I may, the prosecution requests time to verify the authenticity of this document and to consult with relevant government agencies regarding the defendant's claims. Judge Whitmore looked at Morrison with something approaching sympathy, recognizing in her expression the same confusion and potential professional embarrassment that he was feeling. Miss Morrison, I think that's a reasonable request. Dr. Kane, can you provide guidance on how this court should verify the authenticity of this authorization? Alexandra had anticipated this question and had prepared for the necessary verification procedures. Your Honor, the document contains verification codes that can be authenticated through the Pentagon's Classified Document Verification System. Additionally, General Crawford's office has been authorized to provide limited confirmation of my participation in the March 12th briefing, subject to appropriate security clearance protocols. Judge Whitmore realized that he was entering territory that was completely outside his normal judicial experience. Federal courts dealt with classified material occasionally, but usually in the context of cases that had already been processed through national security channels. Dr. Kane, I need to ask you directly. During the period covered by these charges, were you acting as an agent of the United States government in an official capacity? Yes, Your Honor. I was operating under direct presidential authorization as an external consultant for a classified extraction mission that successfully returned 12 American citizens to safety. The judge felt the weight of his potential mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. He looked around the courtroom, noting the attention of the few observers who had wandered into the public hearing, the court reporter who was documenting every word for what was now clearly a case of extraordinary circumstances, and the bailiff who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Dr. Kane, I believe this court owes you a profound apology. If what you're telling us is accurate, then we have been attempting to prosecute someone who was serving her country in the highest possible capacity. Alexandra maintained her respectful demeanor despite the dramatic shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Your Honor, no apology is necessary. Operational security requirements meant that the nature of my activities had to remain classified until mission completion. The court was operating with the information available through normal legal channels. But Judge Whitmore knew that wasn't entirely accurate. He had been quick to judge, quick to assume guilt, quick to dismiss the possibility that there might be extraordinary circumstances beyond his understanding. His reputation for rigid adherence to protocol and his confidence in the prosecution's seemingly airtight case had blinded him to the possibility that Dr. Kane might have completely legitimate reasons for her presence at the Pentagon. Dr. Kane, before we proceed further, I need to understand something. What exactly did this mission accomplish? What were the stakes involved for these American hostages? Alexandra's response carried the weight of someone who had seen the human cost of international terrorism and understood the precious value of American lives. Your Honor, 12 American citizens who were being held hostage by the terrorist organization Crimson Dawn in an underground facility in Libya were successfully extracted and returned to safety. These individuals included James Cooper, a New York Times correspondent, doctor; Lisa Thompson from Doctors Without Borders; Mark Stevens from ExxonMobil; Professor Rachel Davis from Columbia University; Emily Rodriguez from the American Embassy in Tripoli, and 7 other civilians including humanitarian workers, business consultants, and embassy staff members. She paused, allowing the full impact of her words to register with everyone in the courtroom. The mission prevented 12 executions that were scheduled to begin on March 13th, and avoided what could have become a significant international crisis requiring much larger military intervention with potential for substantial casualties. Judge Whitmore felt a chill as he contemplated how close he had come to imprisoning someone who had prevented such a catastrophe. Dr. Kane, can you tell this court what would have happened to those hostages if your mission had not been successful? Your Honor, based on Crimson Dawn's established pattern and their public statements, the hostages would have been executed one by one in videos, broadcast to international media, starting with the most high-profile individuals. The psychological impact would have been designed to pressure policy changes and prisoner releases that the United States government could not have agreed to under any circumstances. The courtroom had become completely silent, as everyone present grappled with the reality that they were hearing about events of international significance from someone who had been directly involved in preventing a major crisis that could have dominated headlines worldwide. Judge Whitmore made a decision that would define the remainder of his judicial career. Dr. Kane, these charges are being dismissed immediately and completely. Furthermore, I want to state for the record that this court recognizes your extraordinary service to the United States and your role in protecting American lives. Alexandra stood slowly, gathering the few materials she had brought with her. Your Honor, serving one's country sometimes requires accepting misunderstandings in the interest of operational security. The successful return of American citizens to their families is recognition enough for any operation. As she prepared to leave, Judge Whitmore felt compelled to make a statement that went beyond the normal boundaries of judicial proceedings. Dr. Kane, I want to say something that will be part of the permanent record of this court. In 28 years on this bench, I have never encountered someone who has served their country with such distinction while maintaining such grace under the most challenging circumstances. He paused, looking directly at her with newfound respect. This court and this nation owes you a debt of gratitude that can never be adequately repaid. 12 American families will gather around their dinner tables tonight because of your courage, skill, and dedication. That represents service at the highest level of American ideals. Alexandra nodded respectfully. Your Honor, if I may offer one final observation. The most meaningful recognition for any operation is the knowledge that American citizens are safe and that families who were facing devastating loss are instead preparing for joyful reunions. That knowledge is worth more than any formal recognition could ever be. She turned and walked toward the courtroom exit, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence that had settled over the proceedings. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back one final time. Your Honor, the people who serve in the shadows to protect others rarely seek recognition, and they almost never receive it. But they continue to serve because they understand that some things are more important than personal acknowledgement. The safety of American citizens is one of those things. With that, Doctor, Alexandra Kane walked out of the federal courtroom, leaving behind a judge who would never again make assumptions about quiet defendants, a prosecutor who would never again be completely confident in seemingly straightforward cases, and a room full of people who had witnessed something they would never forget. Judge Whitmore sat in silence for several minutes after her departure, staring at the classified document that had changed everything. The weight of what had almost happened, the near imprisonment of someone who had just saved 12 American lives, was almost overwhelming. Finally, he looked up at the court reporter. Miss Chen, I want this entire proceeding sealed under federal security classification. No transcripts released, no public records accessible, no media access permitted. This remains classified indefinitely. Sarah Chen nodded, her hands still trembling slightly from what she had witnessed. "Yes, Your Honor. Complete seal, absolutely no exceptions." Judge Whitmore then addressed the prosecutor. "Miss Morrison, I'm sure you understand that this case has implications far beyond normal federal prosecutions. I trust that your office will coordinate with the appropriate agencies to ensure that no similar mistakes occur in the future." Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison, still clearly shaken by the day's revelations, managed to respond professionally. "Yes, Your Honor. We'll be implementing additional verification procedures for cases involving potential national security personnel." Judge Whitmore stood and walked slowly to his chambers, carrying with him the classified document and the crushing weight of a mistake that could have had catastrophic consequences for both national security and his own career. As he closed his office door, he found himself wondering how many other Alexandra Cains were serving in silence, protecting people who would never know their names or understand the magnitude of their sacrifices. The courtroom emptied gradually, but the few observers who had been present would carry the story with them for the rest of their lives. Not the classified operational details, which they understood must remain secret, but the image of a quiet woman who had faced down the federal justice system with nothing but the truth and the knowledge that she had served her country when it mattered most. In the days that followed, Judge Whitmore would request a transfer to a different jurisdiction, telling colleagues that he needed a change of scenery after nearly 3 decades on the same bench. But those close to him suspected that the encounter with Dr. Alexandra Cain had fundamentally altered his perspective on justice, service, and the extreme danger of making assumptions about people whose complete stories you don't fully understand. The federal courthouse returned to its normal routine of processing tax evasion cases, fraud prosecutions, and routine regulatory violations. But the staff in Courtroom 7 would occasionally reference the Cain case when discussing the critical importance of thorough investigation and the possibility that sometimes defendants possess information that isn't immediately apparent through conventional legal discovery. Meanwhile, Dr. Alexandra Cain disappeared back into the classified world where heroes work without recognition, protect without public acknowledgement, and serve without any expectation of gratitude or reward. Her personnel file, stored in a secure facility that didn't officially exist on any government organizational chart, was updated with a single line: Operation Ghost Retrieval, complete success, presidential commendation, classification level, permanent. But in government offices throughout Washington, senior officials who had been briefed on the operation's remarkable success would occasionally look at their calendars and remember that on certain days, when international crises erupted and American lives hung in the balance, there were people like Alexandra Cain who stepped forward to accomplish what others considered completely impossible. The actual details of Operation Ghost Retrieval would remain classified for decades, but the broad outlines of the mission revealed the extraordinary complexity and risk involved in extracting 12 American hostages from a heavily fortified underground facility controlled by well-armed, ideologically motivated terrorists who had established an execution timeline designed to maximize international pressure on the United States government. The operation had required Alexandra to infiltrate the facility through a complex ventilation system, disable sophisticated security and communication equipment, locate and organize 12 hostages who had been held in separate cells, and guide them through a dangerous evacuation route that involved underground tunnels, natural cave systems, and a precisely coordinated extraction by helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft operating in hostile territory. The successful mission had been achieved with 0 casualties among hostages, rescue personnel, or even opposing forces, demonstrating the kind of professional excellence that characterized operations conducted under presidential authorization at the highest levels of national security. The 12 families affected by the crisis had experienced the full emotional range from absolute despair to overwhelming relief as they progressed from expecting devastating phone calls about executed loved ones to receiving word that everyone was safe and en route home. Parents who had prepared themselves for the worst news imaginable instead found themselves planning reunion celebrations. Spouses who had faced the prospect of sudden widowhood instead looked forward to normal family conversations. Children who might have grown up without parents instead anticipated regular family dinners and bedtime stories. The international implications of the successful rescue extended far beyond the immediate humanitarian impact. The operation had demonstrated American capability to protect its citizens worldwide without engaging in prisoner negotiations that would encourage future hostage-taking or launching large-scale military interventions that could destabilize entire regions and result in significant military and civilian casualties. Government analysts estimated that the successful extraction had prevented a crisis that could have required months of complex diplomatic negotiations, prisoner exchanges that would have encouraged similar terrorist operations, or military interventions that could have resulted in substantial casualties and serious international complications affecting American relationships with allies and regional partners. But for Alexandra Kane, the most important measure of success was both simpler and more profound than any strategic analysis. 12 American citizens had been scheduled for public execution, and instead they were returning home to families who loved them and communities that needed their contributions. That knowledge was worth more than any formal recognition or official commendation could ever be. The classified archives contained detailed after-action reports, comprehensive tactical analyses, and extensive recommendations for future similar operations. But the human story of Operation Ghost Retrieval would remain largely unknown, except to those directly involved and the families whose lives had been forever changed by the successful mission. 6 months after the operation, the 12 rescued Americans had returned to their normal lives, carrying the shared understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary during their captivity and rescue. They carried with them the knowledge that when hope seemed completely lost and death appeared inevitable, someone had possessed the rare combination of skill, courage, and determination required to accomplish what everyone else considered impossible. James Cooper, the New York Times correspondent, had returned to journalism, but dedicated much of his subsequent work to highlighting stories of unsung heroes and the people who serve in shadows to protect others without seeking recognition or reward. His writing took on a depth and appreciation for quiet service that hadn't been present in his earlier work. Dr. Lisa Thompson had returned to her medical missions with Doctors Without Borders, carrying renewed faith in human courage and the possibility of good prevailing even in the most desperate circumstances. Her experience had given her unique insights into psychological resilience and the factors that allow people to maintain hope when facing impossible situations. Mark Stevens, the ExxonMobil operations manager, had used his business background and personal experience to establish a comprehensive foundation supporting families of Americans held hostage worldwide, providing resources, advocacy, and expert guidance for situations where loved ones faced similar life-threatening crises. Professor Rachel Davis from Columbia University had written extensively about psychological resilience under extreme stress, contributing valuable academic research about the human factors that allow people to survive and maintain hope during prolonged captivity and life-threatening situations. Emily Rodriguez had returned to diplomatic service with the American Embassy system, carrying deeper appreciation for the people who work behind the scenes to protect American interests and citizens abroad. Her experience had provided unique insights into the human cost of international conflicts and the immense value of successful crisis resolution. The other 7 hostages, including a petroleum engineer working on infrastructure projects, a humanitarian aid worker distributing medical supplies in conflict zones, a business consultant advising on economic development initiatives, a freelance photographer documenting social conditions, and 3 embassy staff members, had each resumed their careers and personal lives, but all carried the profound memory of professional competence appearing in their darkest hour and guiding them to safety. What none of them ever learned was the complete story of how their rescuer had been arrested, prosecuted, and nearly convicted for the very mission that had saved their lives. They never discovered that a federal judge had received the most important lesson of his career about the extreme danger of judging heroes who work in silence to protect others. But in quiet moments, they would remember the calm, authoritative voice that had appeared when hope was completely lost, and they understood instinctively that somewhere in the world there were people working to protect others without seeking recognition, without expecting gratitude, and without needing anything more than the knowledge that they had served when service was desperately needed. Dr. Alexandra Kane continued her work as an external consultant for operations that would never be acknowledged publicly but would continue to protect American lives and interests around the world. Her success rate remained classified at the highest levels, but government officials who had worked with her understood that when conventional options failed and impossible became the only remaining choice, she was the person they called. The business card she didn't carry would have been completely blank. The office she didn't maintain would have had no address listed in any directory. The achievements she would never discuss would never be declassified for public recognition. But in the hearts of 12 American families who had been spared devastating loss, in the minds of government officials who understood the true cost of freedom, and in the memory of a federal judge who had learned that justice sometimes wears unexpected disguises, Alexandra Kane's service would never be forgotten. Her story represented the thousands of men and women who serve in classified capacities around the world, protecting American citizens and interests through operations that will never be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. They work without recognition, serve without awards ceremonies, and succeed without public applause because they understand that some things are fundamentally more important than personal acknowledgement or career advancement. The most powerful recognition for their service is the simple knowledge that American families remain whole, that international crises are resolved without escalating into larger conflicts, and that freedom continues to exist because people are willing to work in complete silence to protect it from those who would destroy it. And sometimes, late at night when the world seems particularly dangerous and the news is filled with stories of international crises and threatened American citizens, it's worth remembering that there are people like Dr. Alexandra Kane working in shadows to ensure that the impossible becomes merely challenging, and that American families can sleep safely knowing that quiet heroes are standing watch. Don't forget to subscribe to Real Heroes Stories YouTube